Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fuel Poverty Action's series of monthly learning sessions, Fuel for Thought, from fuel poverty to climate justice. Fuel Poverty Action is a group of ordinary people fed up with being robbed by greedy energy companies through spiraling bills and rip-off prepayment meters. At Fuel Poverty Action, we campaign to protect people from fuel poverty, and we challenge these rip-off energy companies and unfair policies that leave people to endure cold homes, and we take action for warm, well-insulated homes and clean and affordable energy, which is under the control of people and communities, not private companies. And Fuel for Thought is our space to share research and lived experience, tackle lies, and clear up confusion on fuel poverty and climate change, as we ask and answer questions with experts, activists, and campaigners. As I'm sure you all know, the subject we're going to be discussing today is oil and war, so energy and conflict, and we have some fantastic speakers here to explore this topic, which, although very much related to fuel poverty, is, a little bit further outside of Fuel Poverty Action's usual area of work. And first up, we have Adam Hanieh, who is Professor of Political Economy and Global Development at the Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He's also a research fellow at the Transnational Institute, and his work focuses on the political economy of the Middle East, especially the Gulf states. Adam Hanieh has also got a new book called Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, which is forthcoming with Verso in September 2024. And Adam is going to speak to us, give us a little bit of an overview to introduce this evening's subject. Adam, welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Amal, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. What I wanted to do in my short remarks is just give a little bit of an overview of the relationship between oil and war, oil and militarism, both historically and in the current moment, and also speak a little bit at the end about some of the changing characteristics of the oil industry, the geographical changes that are happening in the oil industry globally in the last period. I guess the central message to come across here is that oil is really being joined at the hip with war making, with militarism, since the early 20th century. In fact, I think a strong argument can be made that the reason that we live in an oil-centered world today, which basically began in the middle of the 20th century, when oil became the dominant fossil fuel, has much to do with war. And war making through both the First World War and the Second World War. Indeed, if we look at the early 20th century, it was the decisions of both the American and British governments to transition their naval forces to oil, to running on oil rather than coal, that began this process of oil, centering oil as kind of the principal energy source globally. So if we look at why that happened, some of you might be familiar with this, but the key figure here in Britain was, of course, Winston Churchill, who at the time advocated the shift to oil for the British Navy, arguing that this made the ships lighter and faster. It improved, it allowed more troops to be held, and also and more weapons to be held, and also made it easier to refuel. And this was mirrored also in the United States, where the same kind of policy took place. And what this meant, it meant in the area of navies, but also all of these new kind of war technologies that came through the First and Second World War, like tanks, submarines, obviously jets, airplane fighters, and so forth. All the motorized vehicles that ran on petroleum. It meant that militaries became solidly oil-based, petroleum-based through the war, and this then generated a huge demand for oil through that early 20th century history, particularly during the Second World War. What this did was it made war, number one, much more deadly, but it also meant that securing oil supplies became a principal goal of Western states, Britain and the United States in particular. And it's really, I think, interesting or important to kind of trace the history of some of the big Western oil companies. You can see the way that they were connected to an attempt to secure oil for militaries. So, for example, BP, the big British oil company that we all know today, got its start as its initial kind of naming was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, and this was set up and supported by the British government because of Britain's interest in Iran. And an attempt by the British to secure Iranian oil in the early 20th century in order to supply the British military, the British Navy. This is where BP came from. It's joined at the hip with this with war, basically. This continued even more so after World War II, and I think it's important to say here that there is a whole range of other kinds of oil products that were integrated into war making. So petrochemicals beyond just fuel. So petrochemicals, artificial rubbers, synthetic products that were used in explosives, all of these kinds of products that ultimately derived from oil became again essential to actually how militaries operated. So the atomic bomb, for example, would not have been possible without petrochemical products and new kinds of plastics that were derived from oil. And similarly with a number of other kinds of explosives that emerged during the Second World War. So what does this mean today? Number one, it means that this search to secure oil really sits at the heart of how militaries operate, and I would make the argument that would be impossible to kind of see any shift away from oil as long as militaries continue to be so dependent upon petroleum as a fuel and through those other kinds of products that I spoke to. Today, the largest institutional consumer, or the largest single consumer of oil on the planet, is the US military. And the US military is therefore the largest emitter of carbon, of greenhouse gases as a consequence of that consumption of oil. So there's really no way of breaking with oil as long as that continues to be the case. But the other thing that's not widely known is that in many of the climate treaties that we see, including the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, as well as the Paris Agreement 2015, these international climate treaties exempted militaries from emissions reporting. So when we speak about the emissions that are calculated as part of each country's carbon accounting, the emissions by militaries are exempted from these kinds of balance sheets, including the largest one in the world, which is the US military. So again, we can see the ways that the military really sits at the center of the oil industry and the consumption of oil, but it's hidden, it's obscured in the way that the climate effects of oil manifest themselves. The other thing that I would say here is, of course, that there's a very close connection with the conflicts that we see around the world today, including what we see today in Gaza. And I don't want to speak about this, but as I know, we have a speaker from Energy Embargo. But there's many conflicts around the world today that are ultimately oil-related conflicts. There was one estimate from a couple of years ago that said about a third of all interstate conflicts since 1973, so we're talking about 50 years now, have been oil-related, have been caused by oil-related conflicts. So we see the way this kind of intersection of oil, not just in the ways that militaries operate, but also in the root cause of war making today. The other side to this, which I'm very happy to speak to a bit more in discussion, is that those countries, such as, in particular, the big oil producers in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and the other Gulf states, are now major oil producers, but they are also, from the sale of oil, have accumulated a lot of wealth. And much of this wealth gets spent on weapons. So the link with how oil, the wealth from the sale of oil also circulates into the military industry. So the largest consumers of military hardware and weapons in the world today are actually the Gulf states in the Middle East in terms of imports of sales of military hardware. So we can see kind of the way that oil is not just a raw material that's used to wage war. It's also its financial wealth circulates into the military economy in these multiple ways globally. The final comments, I know I'm only supposed to speak for 10 minutes, so I'm just going to wrap up in this last minute. And I just want to make the point, and again, this is something perhaps we can talk about more in discussion, but when we're thinking about the oil industry today, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to those big oil producers in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in particularly Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is the national oil company of Saudi Arabia. It is by far the biggest oil company in the world today. By far, it dwarfs all of the big Western oil companies like BP, like ExxonMobil, like Shell. But this oil, Saudi Aramco, has really kind of transitioned in the last 10 or so years from being not just a producer of crude oil, but also a downstream manufacturer of petrochemicals, of refining, of plastics. And this is really kind of following the path of the Western oil companies, the path followed by Western oil companies in the 20th century, becoming this kind of vertically integrated mammoth company that really kind of dominates the industry today. And one thing that this is reflected in is the way that a lot of the climate discussions and debates and the direction of international climate policy is now being steered to a much greater degree by these Gulf states. We could see this, of course, reflected in COP28, which held in the UAE under the stewardship of the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So I think when we're thinking about how the industry works today, we need to think about it not simply in the sense of those big Western companies, BP, Shell, Exxon, and so forth, but ground out our approach in a much more global perspective, where we put we understand the new role of these big oil producers in the Gulf. So I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing the other speakers and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that very concise overview. Really appreciate that. Next, we're going to hear from Energy Embargo for Palestine, who are a British-based anti-imperialist climate collective seeking to disrupt energy flow for the isolation of Zionism. And yes, as Adam alluded to, they will be speaking on how oil relates to the ongoing war on Gaza. Uh, Energy Embargo for Palestine, thank you for joining us.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ML and Fuel Poverty Action for having us. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone today and also to be sharing a panel and hearing from such great comrades with such a wealth of knowledge and experience about fossil fuels, militarism, the world economy, and all that. So yeah, like Amal said, I'm from Energy Embargo for Palestine, a British-based anti-imperialist climate collective seeking to disrupt energy flow for the confrontation and isolation of Zionism in Britain. And so before I get into sort of the role of energy in Palestine, both historically and in the current moment, I just wanted to dwell a little bit on the word energy. So we've been talking about oil, but why are we called energy instead of oil or fossil fuels? It's because we're not just talking about the source of energy, sustainable or not. We're talking about the flow of energy, what activities energy is used to fuel. So we're talking about how energy is being exported to Israel to fuel fighter jets and fuel genocide and occupation. So frankly, we don't really care if that energy comes from hydrogen or solar, if it comes from fracking, if it's ultimately just going to be used for genocide. And the climate movement has to start looking beyond carbon emissions and carbon targets towards the actual uses of our energy. Because if most of our energy production is still going towards militarism that is killing people on our planet, then have we even moved an inch closer to climate justice? And equally, we also seek to politicize energy in international solidarity struggles. We look closely at cross-continental pipelines to see which direction energy flows in, to see who is fueling the Zionist entity. So these pipelines are really tangible manifestations of the global flows of capital, and they allow us to trace where power lies and who it is exerted against. And these are some of the interventions our collective aims to make. And this is exactly where a historical analysis of energy in Palestine informs our work. So Lala Khalili recently published some great research on the history of energy in Palestine, which I'm just going to take a little bit from right now. So one of the things she writes about is the Palestine Electric Company, which was a Zionist organization laying the foundations of the settler colonial project during the British Mandate before the Nakba. So the British Mandate granted land concessions to the Palestine Electric Company to build power plants and an extensive electricity grid. Specifically, the company wanted to produce hydroelectric power by exploiting the Jordan River, the Yarmouk River, Auja River, and the Litani River. And in order to control the rivers, you have to control the land around it. And the land that the British gave to the Palestine Electric Company to build these power stations and the electricity grids was also used to build settlements. So we can already see how energy and the need to build energy infrastructure was used to dispossess and seize land for the settler colonial project. And this is in fact something that Palestinian resistance has recognized from the very beginning. From the 1920s, Palestinians protested the Palestine Electric Company's projects. And during the 1936 to 39 revolution in Palestine, groups targeted pipelines because they understood energy as the lifeblood of the Zionist project. And from the very beginning, we can already see through these energy projects that an apartheid system was taking root. And so this is not a new phenomenon, even though it's only become popular in recent years in like Western political discourse. So not only was the electrical power distributed unevenly, with 90% of the electricity being consumed by settlers who made up less than 40% of the population, but this energy infrastructure was also built upon a system of racialized labor, in which Palestinian workers earned a fraction of the wages of Jewish laborers. And this dynamic continues today. Israel's project of displacing Palestinians from their land, its policies of land grabbing and expanding settlements, these are reinforced by deliberate restriction of access to electricity and water infrastructure to deprive Palestinians and essentially force them off their land. So we can see how energy, in general, is wielded as a weapon of settler colonialism. The Palestine Electric Company, by laying down the extensive electricity grid from the river to the sea, enabled the Zionist entity to impose control over Palestinian life and land. And it still uses this power even now, as Israel regularly cuts access to fuel in Gaza and subjects Palestinians to blackouts. So let's come to today, right? So how does energy play a part in the current genocide in Gaza? So one thing is you might be aware of the naval blockade, which limits Palestinian access to its territorial waters under international law. But you might not know that this is partly because of energy infrastructure. This naval blockade securitizes the Arish-Ashkelon Chevron pipeline that exports gas from the Tamar and Leviathan gas fields for Israeli profit. And it also securitizes the Tamar gas platform, which is key to the production of gas and the fueling of the Zionist entity, since the Tamar gas field accounts for 70% of Israel's energy needs. And so energy infrastructure provides the justification for this naval blockade, in part, for shooting Palestinian fishermen and shooting Palestinian kids on beaches, for these policies of settler colonial dispossession. And this process of dispossession is continuing to expand. So 1 month into the current genocide, Israel granted gas exploration licenses to 6 companies, one of which is BP, and I'll come back to BP in a bit. And BP also fuels Israel with oil it extracts and transports from Azerbaijan through the BTC pipeline. So these gas exploration licenses will drill into more stolen Palestinian waters with the goal of discovering more gas reserves to extract natural gas and make profit from stolen Palestinian resources. So when we think about who enacts settler colonialism, it also includes private corporations founded in colonial extraction, with BP as just one example. And settler colonialism is not just something that states do, but rather our entire imperialist economic system is bound up in and facilitates these violent processes of colonial expansion and ultimately theft. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the energy industry and settler colonialism and imperialism worldwide. Colonial violence is enshrined into how the energy industrial complex is able to exist. What is BP without its coups, and what is the imperialist capitalist world order without BP? So when we speak about Western complicity, we must move a bit beyond the state-centric notion that it is just governments that sponsor and provide cover for Israel's genocidal settler colonial project, because these companies are also active agents of settler colonialism. And so to bring it back to the campaign that I'm speaking on behalf of now, with all this information, what are we doing about it? So our first campaign targets the British Museum, not least for being the official home of British colonial looting, but also for its sponsorship deal with BP. So over the past decade, the British Museum has been subject to protests from environmental groups for taking money from BP. Most recently, they renewed a £50 million 10-year partnership with BP. And within the energy industry, educational and cultural partnerships like this form a part of attempts to manufacture a social license to operate. BP even uses the museum as a venue for political lobbying. So we target the British Museum because this partnership is actually a bit more valuable to BP than it is to the museum. They're getting quite a bit out of it. And we've been organizing mass participatory mobilizations and teach-outs at the museum, and we've managed to shut it down 3 times. Because BP fuels the Zionist entity with oil from Azerbaijan, and because BP has been awarded gas exploration licenses in stolen Palestinian waters, we are saying that these multinational energy companies that have staged coups and secured the interests of the global capitalist class throughout history, they cannot continue getting away with this and to be invisibilized and not held accountable in the process. We always have to look at who's benefiting from death and destruction, who is using this genocide as an opportunity to make business deals. And that's what informs our targets, and that's what informs our action. We do all of this with the knowledge that here in the West, we are fighting Zionism along another very important front from within the imperial core. And so we must do all that we can to isolate Zionism and make Western support for it untenable by targeting its infrastructure and its pressure points, be that arms, finance, or fuel. Yeah, eager to talk more about this, but that's what I got.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate having you on. And yes, I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of the things that you said in the discussion. Next, we're going to hear from Ken Henshaw, who is a Nigerian climate and environment rights campaigner based in the Niger Delta, and is joining us through We the People this evening. Ken, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. And thank you for the very exciting conversation. So I'm going to speak from a somewhat different angle, somewhat from a historical point of view. And I'm going to be talking about oil extraction in Nigeria's Niger Delta and how this has fueled a very sickening militarism in the entire region. So first, some history. When Nigeria was a colonial entity, a British colonial entity, the British authority from the start handed over a license, a permit, to a company called Shell the Acre. And this permit basically gave the entire Nigerian nation to one company to explore for crude oil anywhere it found it. So it didn't matter whether it was your land, whether it was your creek, your sea, your fishing port, it didn't matter. You had the right to go into people's farmland and extract for crude oil. In 1956, Shell the Acre had become Shell, which we know today, declared that they had found crude oil in commercial quantities in a place in the Niger Delta called Oloibiri. Now, all through this period between 1938, when the company was granted that license, till 1956, when the company first struck crude oil, at no point was the free, prior, or informed consent of the indigenous Niger Delta people sought. So the people will just see cranes and heavy-duty equipment in their backyards, beginning to drill the land. And when they complain, there was always the British military. So from the very start, oil extraction in the Niger Delta was state repression, supported, the oil companies supported by state repression. At the start, it was colonial state repression. In 1960, when Nigeria became independent, that duty moved away from the British colonial forces and became the responsibility of the Nigerian army. And that relation of production in terms of oil extraction has continued. So today, the Nigerian state continues to hold down communities of the Niger Delta, and I mean 40 million people in the Niger Delta region, just so that oil companies can keep extracting. And so today, the oil industry in the Niger Delta has expanded significantly. It's several companies. It's Shell, it's ExxonMobil, it's Total Energies, it's Eni Ajib, it's Chevron, it's every colonial power in the Niger Delta extracting from crude oil. And if you go to a typical oil extraction site in the Niger Delta, the first thing you see is a big military sentry. So they create this military outposts up there, and you see well-armed men with machine guns pointed at the community. And I mean every single oil extraction site, there's a gun pointed at the community. The Niger Delta is probably the most militarized place in the entire country, most militarized. Traveling to the Niger Delta, we have to go by boat because it's mostly water. I have to raise my hands up every 5 minutes because there's a gunboat somewhere. You need to raise your hands up to show that you surrender already. And imagine how indignifying it is. In my own land, in my own space, in my own river, I have to raise my hands up in surrender. And so, like I said earlier, it's been a corporate wedlock between the oil companies and military force. It's two sides of the same coin. They have operated like a wedlock, repressing the people in order for corporate greed to continue. And every time the people of the Niger Delta have complained about the very nasty relations of production in the Niger Delta region, Shell and the other oil companies have always found it very convenient and easy to call in Nigerian military forces. So in 1990s, the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta complained about the relations of production. They said the environment was polluted. They say they needed better benefits from the oil sector. And all Shell did was to call the Nigerian state. And one of the worst genocides that has been committed in the history of Nigeria was committed against the Ogoni people. People were raped, exiled, murdered. And today, up till today, nobody has been held to account for what happened to the Ogonis. And that happened because oil needed to be extracted from the Niger Delta region. But the Ogoni experience is popular. There are countless other experiences similar to that have taken place in the Niger Delta region. In 1990, there's another community that also made the same request of Shell. And Shell again called in military forces. That community called Umu-Echem, you could Google it. That community was invaded, literally invaded. Over 200 people were killed and their bodies taken in a truck and dumped in a river. It's called the Umuechim massacre. Up till today, no single person has been held to account. And we see these things happen. That they are packing up and leaving the Niger Delta region. They are divesting, they are selling off assets. Niger Delta communities again have come out and said, listen, you have been in my environment, you have been in my community, you have destroyed, you have polluted, you have murdered for 70 years. You don't get to walk away without fixing the mess you have created. And what have they done again? They have again militarized the Niger Delta region. More security forces have come into the Niger Delta region. And the idea is simple, to give that same military hardware, that military support needed to escort the oil companies out of the Niger Delta after 70 years of destruction. Just to conclude, let me put this, that the illicit wedlock between the Nigerian state and oil companies has created a state that doesn't represent the Nigerian people, has created a state in the image of the oil companies, has created a state that would rather protect the interests of oil companies than the interests of its own people. It has created a state that owes allegiance, owes respect, and owes benefit only to oil companies. Our campaigns in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, under the banner of We the People, is to make our state more responsible. Our campaign is to delink the Nigerian state from oil companies and force our own country, our own government, to think of us as citizens rather than as subjects. And so this is a fight we're leading, and we're leading it from the front. And we have received tremendous support from people across the world, including, comrades from Europe. Yeah, so I guess I'll pause there, believing that we'll have time to have a discussion around this. Thank you very much.
Ken, thank you so much for the contribution. Really appreciate it. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Shireen Talat, who is a feminist and advocate with around 15 years of experience building coalitions and campaigns around social and economic and environmental rights. Shireen is the director and founder of the MinaFem movement, which is dedicated to economic, developmental, and ecological justice, and works towards right-based economic policies with a particular focus on debt justice, feminist economics, and climate justice. Shireen, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Amal, and thanks for my colleagues and comrades who spoke before me, and also for the people who gave the time to attend our session today. I want to, and I mean, like, the context is very, very powerful, and I want to follow this discussion of what us as MinaFem are focusing on, in actually that is closing the circle, the historical circle of extravism, of oil and climate change, the historical colonial circle, the imperialism. So here I want to speak about our efforts around cancel the debt, ending austerity, and pay up for climate finance. Recently, with colleagues from ABBMD and other, we launched the Pay Up Climate Finance campaign. We all know that the G7 was meeting. For who doesn't know the G7, it's part of the biggest European and countries plus America plus the European Union, who are actually controlling the world. So they are they had this meeting recently, and this specific campaign was directed to them. What is Pay Up for Climate Finance? The people and communities of the global south are suffering multiple crises, made worse by the global remarkable and the favor of corporate interests over the need of people. Of course, corporate interests and the most significant investment and finance go to the energy sector, the fossil fuels sectors in the past. the new the recent maybe 5 years for the renewable energy sector, but they are the same key players. At the time when public funds are desperately needed for people needs and rights, they refuse to respond to the clamor of the cancellation of public debt in the South, which they, together with their elites and corporations, bear the biggest responsibility for. And instead of promote failed, flawed, and futile debt reduction measures and offer more loans, these governments claim to not have enough public fund to deliver on their financial obligations towards the global South, but spend trillions of fossil fuel subsidized and military infrastructure and operation, instead of addressing tax abuses of huge multinational corporations that are the global polluters and profiteers. They advance global tax deals favoring the rich, the unjust and inequitable global economic and financial architecture, legacies of colonialism causes an annual net resources transfer from the South to the North in the trillion. The G7 and other rich countries' government have consistently failed to meet their fair share of domestic and international climate action. G7 countries are responsible of 27% of the global oil and gas production and nearly half of the CO2 emissions from new oil and gas production. The United States is the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. The same countries also spent upwards $1 trillion USD in 2022 in funding war and conflict globally, instead of prioritizing addressing the climate crisis, and yet they have insisting in avoiding fulfilling their obligation to provide finance of global South. So that's why we launched our campaign, Pay Up for Climate Finance. And the ultimate problem that still exists in the MENA region, that you will find we are a hot zone, and you will find all the conflict, all the colonial attempt behind the scenes are always energy. I mean, going back to my colleague who were speaking about the genocide in Palestine, Gaza is actually floating under oil and gas. And specifically after the war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, Europe has been in need of an energy provider that can fill the gaps. طبعا, of course, Israel was trying to build a pipeline to export the gas to Europe since then. And of course, this specific space in this world is occupied by people. So imagine with me, a reservoir was discovered in December 2010, the new Med Energy, with tons of gallons, and the obstacle need to be eliminated. And this obstacle was the Palestinian people, that the genocide is still keeping going till now. This is how vicious is the oil industry. This is how the fossil fuels are not only killing us by climate change, but by financing war to kill people for more investments towards oil. And imagine it or not, in more investment in oil, not only despite of committing genocide, but that is creating more debt burden on our nations who are the more, I'm coming from Egypt, one of the most indebted countries in the world, and I live in Morocco, one of the most indebted countries in North Africa. So, and our countries are pushed to invest in fossil fuels to be able to pay the debt. So that means living under harmful and harsh austerity measure, cutting on public spending, cutting on major life means like health and education and others. There was a study made by our colleagues, Oil Change. It was an investigation into the relation between debt and oil. It was Oil Change and Jubilee USA. And the key findings here was increasing oil production leads to increasing debt. There is a strong and positive relationship between oil production and debt burdens. The more oil country produce, regardless of oil share of the country, total economy, the more debt intends to generate. Increasing oil exports leads to increasing debt. There is strong and positive also relationship between oil export and debt burden, and also increasing in oil production predict increasing in debt size. Double a country annual production of crude oil is predicted to increase the size of its total external debt as a share of GDP by 43%. So it's a vicious circle and very related. The World Bank, for example, program was designed to increase northern private investment in the southern oil production. Have instead actually increased that northern multilateral and bilateral aid for oil exporting projects in the south has expanded and rather than elevated debt. And after the efforts, and we were glad to be part, as Mirafem, part of those efforts to push the World Bank to be Paris aligned. The bank last year declared to be Paris aligned, but putting gas in the heart of the transition, which is fossil fuels, which is another creation of another cycle of debt, coming to other investments directed by different European banks, also that is pushing our countries to do investments on fossil fuels, still on gas and oil. I mean, considering gas as a green, I don't know how gas is, from their perspective, a green energy. So we are paying the bills several times. We are paying the bills for years now from the colonialization. We are paying the bill from our souls and heart and blood for the investment of fossil fuels, and we are still paying the bill till this exact moment that we are speaking on. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Shireen. We're now going to move into the second part of the session, where I hand over to everyone else who's joined us this evening for your reactions, your reflections, if you have any stories, questions, or comments. If you'd like to come in, please raise your virtual hand. You can do this by clicking on the three dots at the bottom right of your Zoom window. Look for reactions and click raise hand. If you don't want to speak up, I will also be monitoring the chat, and I'm simply happy to read out your words or your questions. I'm going to allow everyone to unmute, and yeah, please raise your hands. Okay, everyone should be able to unmute now. If we don't have any immediate questions from the floor, I had a question for Ken. Ken, you said that oil extraction essentially has shaped Nigeria to this day, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. What does that look like for the Nigerian people?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amal. Yes, indeed. oil extraction has shaped the character of the Nigerian state and the character of the Nigerian government. So that it goes without saying. So like I told you earlier, the country started oil export in 1956. But before 1956, Nigeria and the different ethnic nationalities in Nigeria made a decent living from other sources of income. Nigeria had a very vibrant textile sector, a vibrant manufacturing sector, vibrant agricultural sector. And indeed, these sectors contributed significantly to the wealth of the Nigerian state. But I did a research 5 years ago, and I did a comparison with how the Nigerian economy grew and how the oil economy grew and how other non-oil sectors responded. So what I found was shocking. As oil extraction was increasing, other sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, textiles, industry, was declining simultaneously. And so at this moment, oil sector contributes 95% of government income today, 95% of government income. And who controls the extraction of crude oil and the sale of this crude oil? It's international, multinational oil companies. And so the government gets money from oil extraction. If the oil companies tell the Nigerian government, if you push that policy, you get no money from oil, the Nigerian government will reverse any policy. If the oil companies tell the Nigerian government, if you let this community protest and shut down this oil extraction facility, you get no money from oil, or your money from oil declines, the Nigerian government immediately responds with repression, because for them, making that revenue is critical and very important. And with this singular fact, with the fact that Nigeria depends almost exclusively on crude oil, and that crude oil is almost exclusively extracted by international oil companies like Shell, Chevron, Exxon, and all that, they can actually totally and fully control the character of the Nigerian state, including the capacity of the Nigerian state to unleash terror by Nigeria's own security forces against Nigeria's own people. That's the connection.
Thank you for that, Ken. We have a question here on the floor. I'm sorry, I can't read Arabic, so I can't read your name. But please,
Mr. Ismail Nu'man.
Thank you, Shireen. Ismail, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. It's the first time for me to attend this seminar, which I find very interesting and useful. Thanks to Shireen, who introduced the link to our group, So it's very interesting, really. I have been myself in the oil and industry business for a long time, but downstream. And it's interesting to see the link that we probably were brainwashed, so we never thought of from that angle, how much damage is being done, how is the relationship going. We only knew the aspects of, colonialism or imperialism or monopoly or whatever. But to the extent that it causes damage to war, in addition, of course, to the environment, is really interesting. And I would suggest that your four speakers were really good and gave good information. Perhaps in some of the cases, if you can have a map or something, so that one could grasp the ideas, because it's interesting to know from the second speaker who said that Israel is getting its oil from Azerbaijan and from Bibi on site, it's that's interesting. And of course, the first speaker gave a good historical and introductory background, from the days of Winston Churchill, and how it came, and the rush for oil concessions all over, So, and I hope you eventually would distribute the summary so that we could benefit from it. Thanks very much, and I wish you all success.
Thank you very much for that, Ismail. Really appreciate it. We also have a comment from Julie in the chat, who who says, I know it's not on the same scale in the UK as it evidently is in Nigeria, but we have seen a massive pushback on climate and environment campaigns here in the UK and a clampdown on protesting. Yes, that is very true. Ken, I did have a little follow-up question actually for you on my previous, something I should have probably said just immediately. But you know, we are here, you know, in a space for biofuel poverty action, and yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how oil companies having such so much power in Nigeria, how does that relate to people's ability to, you know, have electricity, heat their, you know, have electricity in their homes, heat their homes, energy prices, anything that sort of relates to energy.
Well, thank you so much. So first, it's actually quite ironical because 70% of Nigerians have no access to electricity. 70%. Up to 65% of Nigerians still use fuel wood for cooking. And a 12.5 kg of cooking gas, natural cooking gas, is so 25 kg. Okay, that's 12.5 plus 2. 25 kg of cooking gas is the cost of the minimum wage in Nigeria. Okay, so 25 kg is the minimum wage in Nigeria. Energy is extremely expensive in Nigeria, despite the fact that we produce the energy here. And so it's funny. The Nigerian case is quite funny because our abundance of oil and gas has not translated into energy sovereignty or energy sufficiency for the majority of the Nigerian people, right? So we have an oil sector where all the oil extracted, and I mean all of it, every single drop, and at some point it was up to 2.5 million barrels of crude oil extracted every 24 hours. Every single bit of it is shipped to Europe and America. Every single drop of it is shipped to Europe and America. And guess what? We go back to Europe and America and buy petrol, transport it across the Atlantic Ocean to Nigeria and sell to the pumping stations, to the gas stations. So even the petrol, the gas used to run cars here are imported. And this relations of production is very important. It simply shows that from colonial times up to 2024, we still have the exact same relations of production, where Africa, in this case Nigeria, is seen as where raw material is taken from. And then the value addition, the refining, you know, is done abroad in the global north and then sent back here. So we may have crude oil and gas, we may have energy, but the majority of our people live in extreme energy poverty. So recently, the government increased the price of electricity. So in Nigeria, we've got electricity for those who have what they call bands. There are 5 bands of electricity. The highest band of electricity is called band A. So band A, you have power supply between 18 hours and I think 16 hours in a day. Almost nobody has 24 hours power, right? I'm in band B where I live, and that means I have power between 7 hours and 8 hours a day. That's the amount of power I have. People in band E, that's the 5th category of electricity, have maybe 3 to 4 hours of electricity in a week. It's that bad. So the energy generated here doesn't solve our own energy problems. No, it solves the energy problem in Europe. And you know what? It's funny. So I've been to Europe a couple of times, and I have a lot of friends whom I talk to. When they talk about energy, when they talk about gas, when they talk about crude oil, they only mention one part of the reality, which is it provides energy. But that's not the whole story, right? It provides energy to those who use energy. Recently, another angle to the story, has come about that it creates climate change. Yes, that's an additional layer to the problem. But there's one part of that narrative which nobody talks about. It's the fact that it destroys lives. it destroys livelihoods, it abuses rights, it kills people. And that's the reality of 40 million people in the Niger Delta region. And that's the reality Ken Saro-Wiwa died trying to tell the world about. And that's the reality that the world is gradually beginning to recognize and reconcile with.
Thank you very much for that, Ken. Thank you. Yeah, I suppose this, like what you just referred to about energy and how it's used. I think a couple of other speakers have alluded to Adam and energy embargo for Palestine. Yeah, and I was wondering if either of you wanted to come in and comment on that.
Yeah, I could say a few words. I think Ken's comments are really I think really important, really do show the kind of ways that or why it's so important, I think, to get a grasp of how the whole industry functions at a global level. And I think those kinds of downstream sectors like the refining is really important to this, because where the refining happens, you know, in the case, as Ken was saying, you know, refining happening outside of Nigeria, but Nigeria bringing importing those refined products back in, which is typically the way that Western oil companies have been structured in this kind of vertical integration, where you control each step of the oil commodity from its extraction from the ground through to its refining and then turning into plastics and petrochemicals, and then the marketing and sale. And typically that's the way the Western oil companies have been structured. So I think understanding those steps is really important. What I was saying in my comments about the Gulf states are really interesting, though, I think, because the Gulf is now moving into those downstream sectors in a really major way, and in some ways displacing some of those big Western companies in terms of the downstream refining and production. So I think understanding this kind of changing global dynamics is really important to looking at the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I know Sue had a hand, but I might just quickly jump in before Sue asks her question, if that's all right. Yeah, I think when I was speaking about sort of why we look at the flow of energy, like what activities it's used to fuel, as opposed to necessarily the source of energy, that was coming from a place of like at least in Britain, but I suppose like the climate justice movement in the West more broadly, over the years has sort of like been reduced to sort of like carbon emissions and like the sort of carbon focused and sort of stemming carbon like stemming like carbon emissions for the sake of it almost. And so we're talking about like why are we saying like stop these carbon emissions in the first place, right? And really trying to locate sort of climate breakdown within other sorts of injustices in the world and see how they relate to one another, in the sense that it doesn't matter if it's a solar powered fighter jet that's bombing people, because that's also not good. And it's not better if it's a solar powered fighter jet bombing someone than if it were an oil powered fighter jet. And so yeah, just sort of when we think about like the flow of energy, that's sort of the intervention we're trying to make, yeah, is to look at it within the context of like to politicize like the climate justice movement a bit more in terms of looking at like global systems of oppression. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, both of you. Sue, you wanted to come in?
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Good. I hope you can see I'm wearing a green heart. I try to see the best in everybody, but I'm a simple soul, and I'm trying to work out what on earth we can do about this. It's so unfair. Makes me mad.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, what can we do about this? A simple question to which I'm sure the answer is maybe not so simple. Would someone like to come in and answer Sue's question? Any ideas? Shireen, yes?
Yes, I mean, what we can do. I mean, like, there's a lot can be done. There's a lot. First of all, like, keep the oil and gas on the ground, and I guess the harm was caused years ago, because of this capitalistic world that we're living under, that turned the world to this case where we are standing now. Even my dog agree on what I'm saying. The global economical architecture has already failed, and I cannot I mean, like, turn my face away on what is happening in Palestine. What is happening in Palestine was very revealing on how this global economical architecture works and how it deals with the global south. So that needs to end now. This system needs to change. And actually, there is a lot of possibilities. Even if we dig inside the system, there's a lot of policies can be eliminated. There need to be a true initiative, political will from the wealth to end this, and it can happen, and they will remain wealthy as they are, but they don't want to. So changing this global economical system, engage more the climate justice movement, the ending financial fossil fuels movement, and the economical justice movement need to work together on this, of course, from a green feminist approach, an inclusive approach led by the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. Any other comments on how we can move forward?
If I may, yes, please go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Please. No, go.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that, yes, it's a critical question. What do we do? How do we move forward, right? So I'm just going to speak to the strategy which we use at We the People. We realize something fundamental, that it would almost be impossible for us to fight alone, because we have been disempowered for just too long. Our people are weak and dependent, and it to be hard to fight alone. But we understand that we have solidarity partners all over the world. One of the major things that has been able to give the edge to fossil companies around the world is that they are able to take, dollar and pound profits in the billions and go back to their home countries, to their shareholders, and tell them lies. Tell them beautiful lies about what goes on in the places they extract crude oil. They did this story of what oil does to indigenous people. And that's the difference, that we are able now to tell that story through our solidarity partners all over the world. That's the difference. So the first thing for us is counter the disinformation about crude oil and gas. Counter that disinformation. And every single person can do that. Every person with an X handle, with a Facebook page, with whatever, can do that. Join a protest, write a petition, speak to your lawmaker, do whatever it is you can do. Call into a radio show and tell the story. Ecocide, damage of ecocidal proportions are happening in the other part of the world, and it's being perpetuated by people wearing beautiful suits and carrying beautiful briefcases, and they live in business halls. They live in suits. They attend shareholders meetings, and they don't look like murderers, but yes, they are murderers of people and murderers of the environment. We need to be able to tell that story to the extent it becomes a global story that everybody knows, and so there's no hiding place. And just like Sharon said, the end game is that we clean up the environment and we also save the climate. We fight the climate catastrophe by leaving fossil fuels in the ground. The lie has been told for so long that human progress and development is propelled by the extraction of crude oil and gas and coal and burning it. That's what drives human development. We even need to redefine what it means to be developed. Spending trillions of dollars on the biggest war machine in the history of humanity is not development. We need to rethink even development, right? So that's for me, that's where it starts from. We cannot be extracting and using a resource that will inadvertently destroy us. That's not development, that's madness. At some point, we will have to leave this thing in the ground where it belongs.
Thank you very much for that, Ken. Adam, you wanted to come in as well?
Yeah, I would agree fully, and I would say that I think one thing that's come very clearly throughout this whole discussion is the way that oil and gas and other fossil fuels are so integrated into every aspect of our lives. It's not just a question of like, there's a problem, I think, in a lot of the kind of mainstream climate movement to kind of see it as simply a question of what's going on in my backyard. But we need to see the way that oil is bound up with like debt, as a number of speakers have said, with war making, with money, with weapons sales, all of these kinds of struggles, and really, really importantly, the question of Palestine in terms of the wider Middle East. So, we need to see oil as a thing that links all of our struggles, and that it's not possible to speak about the climate without also being an activist around Palestine, without also being an activist around anti-debt work, and so forth. Like all of these, capitalism today is kind of really bound up with oil, and it continues to be. So I do think this kind of seeing the climate as not just a climate issue, but as an issue that is part of all our struggles is really central.
Thank you, Adam. And energy embargo for Palestine?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Ken and Adam and Shadeen were saying. And yeah, thank you, Sue, for asking this question. I think when we discuss these topics of like oil in the world and militarism and war and these huge topics, it seems almost like really intractable and impossible to take on. And given the fact, like Adam said, these are bound up so completely with our lives, and how we experience the world. It seems really difficult to imagine how we would even begin to sort of dismantle that. I would say, yeah, in addition to what Ken has said in terms of fighting the disinformation, a lot of when we formed as a group, a few, like, not all of us came from sort of climate activism backgrounds. Some of us were politicized through other things. For example, a bunch of us were politicized like through Palestine as sort of the first like point of contact of politicization almost. And so what's been quite like challenging, but also in a good way, has been to learn about these links and to really clarify just for ourselves, but also learn how to clarify like the links between climate and Palestine, and show like how intricately related they are, in a way that is like accessible to people. And yeah, and I think like just sort of learning more about it, you can really see how a lot of these energy companies rely on sort of anonymity and existing in the shadows and lurking and no one knowing what they do. You go up to Aberdeen, for example, we talk about like extraction happening in the North Sea, and there's like companies that people haven't even heard of, and they're doing a lot of, digging up and extracting oil, and they're really key players. And so I guess, yeah, like learning about those, but also like being loud about it. There's obviously elections coming up, and politicians, MPs MPs and big oil have really close relationships, and they lobby for one another. They have like shares, they have stakes. They're really embedded within one another. There's a bit of a revolving door, and so yeah, just sort of like paying attention to those links as well. There's a group called Climate Resistance, which in the lead up to the election has sort of been highlighting the role of certain MPs in lobbying for big oil, sort of highlighting their histories of lobbying for BP and their position as whatever minister like a couple of years ago, or this and that. And so yeah, just sort of trying to find them out, not let them exist silently, hidden away. And yeah, I would say that's sort of what we can do as well.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any more questions or comments, contributions from the floor? Yes, Ali.
I just wanted to ask about the use of oil and electricity within warfare, as in using it as a commodity within warfare. For instance, Nord Stream 2 in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and within 3 days of the outbreak of the conflict, there was, tax on the pipelines that were going to be transcontinental pipelines, and limiting the flow of oil, and then the use of it within the military structures after that, as in hitting and targeting oil and electricity and other stations as part of the conflict, and then passing on the costs of that through the markets.
Thank you for that, Ali. Do you have did you have someone in mind maybe to answer your question?
I was just really an open question, as in, the use tactically, within warfare of that, and creating reliances on other commodities and other supplies is manipulative of the marketplace and enhances the international monetary system of the global finances of some of these companies, but it also is seen as being effective as a tactical measure within the warfare and within the conflicts.
Yeah. Would anyone like to comment on that? Does someone feel they have some knowledge on this?
I could just say I think it's very true that the targeting of infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is very much a tactic of warfare, and has been, since the early 20th century in terms of like fossil fuel infrastructure. So, and in Gaza today, we can really see that, it's the targeting of the power stations, the targeting of electricity supply stations, all of these kinds of things have been one way of actually putting more. Israel's attempting to put more pressure on the population, as part of a broader. Someone used the term ecocide earlier. A part of a broader strategy of destroying crops, destroying water pumping stations so that water becomes polluted, that sewage is released into the oceans, all of these ways of kind of making life impossible. And because energy is embedded into every aspect of our lives, it's a very kind of strategic center to target those infrastructures. So I absolutely think that's true, and we see it in all conflicts today.
Thank you, Adam. And I think Ken also alluded to the fact that, well, at least in the context of Nigeria, oil companies use the power that they have over access to energy to also crush dissent against them, which I think is also quite important to mention in going off of what you were talking about, Ali. If we have no one else who has any more questions or comments or anything to share, I think we can close the session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, listening, and participating. And thank you again to our speakers, Adam, Ken, Energy Embargo, and Shireen, for your part in making this so informative. Honestly, it was brilliant. Just to close off, final word on fuel poverty action. We campaign for every household in the UK to be guaranteed enough energy to cover needs, like adequate heating, lighting, and cooking, and also access to medical or mobility aids through our Energy for All campaign. I'm going to link you our website here. Check it out also for our speakers. Maybe you can find some inspiration there, and also let us know how you found the session. It's always great to have some feedback. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight, and look out for a mailing from me. As you signed up to the session, you'll now be on the Fuel Poverty Action mailing lists, so you'll also hear about any actions, events that we put on, including Fuel for Thought. The last of the current series will be next month before we take a break for the month of August and come back in September. If anyone would like to switch their cameras on, unmute yourselves and just give us a wave and say goodnight. That'd be wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody. You look after yourselves. Safe travels.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.